Prologue, the year is 2317. Human species has spread to 4 planets of the solar system and many interplanetary stations. Corporations have come to replace nation-states. Each is represented by a Ross planetary network of megacities, the places where multiple megacities, belonging to different corporations, converge are becoming main coordination centers, the synchroners of which there are thousands in the solar system. The level of a synchroner is determined by the number of corporations that own megacities on its territory and can be changed. The center of human civilization is the synchroner, where the 5 major corporations of the solar system into a single megacity, SynthCorp. The lifting of the ban on changing the human genome led to the disappearance of most life-threatening diseases and extended human life. The increase in brain size made natural birth impossible. The fusion of genetic material and human prenatal development occur entirely. Prologue, the year is 2317. Human species has spread to 4 planets of the solar system and many interplanetary stations. Corporations have come to replace nation-states. Each is represented by a Ross planetary network of megacities, the places where multiple megacities, belonging to different corporations, converge are becoming main coordination centers, the synchroners of which there are thousands in the solar system. The level of a synchroner is determined by the number of corporations that own megacities on its territory and can be changed. The center of human civilization is the synchroner, where the 5 major corporations of the solar system merge into a single megacity, SynthCorp. The lifting of the ban on changing the human genome led to the disappearance of most life-threatening diseases and extended human life. The increase in brain size made natural birth impossible. The fusion of genetic material and human prenatal development occur entirely in external conditions. Nevertheless, artificial changes to the genome have led to a number of new problems, one of the main ones. People have lost the ability to freely exchange genetic material inside their species. In addition to the disappearance of concepts of nationality and citizenship, now replaced by corporate affiliation, the concepts of gender have lost their former social and biological meanings, and differences in these characteristics have become no more significant than differences in the color of eyes, skin, or hair. The concept of strain came into use. Members of the same strain, regardless of their biological sex at birth, can combine their DNA and have common offspring. The DNA of different strains is in most cases incompatible. According to the law on the unification of humanity, all corporations are required to strive for a uniform number of different strains in the population, both within the corporation and at its different sublevels. Union between different strains is highly socially encouraged, since there is still a chance that their DNA can combine. A transplanetary policy of equivalence of strains is being pursued, aimed at reuniting humanity into one species. However, new strains appear every few decades. The physical and mental differences between the 9 main strains are becoming increasingly obvious, and the likelihood that different strains will be able to produce offspring is becoming increasingly less likely. Human civilization is at the stage of formation of new species, some of which show a tendency towards hierarchical primacy. Humanity tries to restrain the division of their species and hierarchical stratification based on strains, since they are unable to predict what the supernova of humanity will turn into the stars of new species, or into a black hole that will consume itself. Due to the complex system of corporations' location, wars in the usual sense became impossible, and intraspecific aggression found another manifestation. Corporations are in a state of constant economic growth, interaction, and confrontation, the most acute phase of which is manifested in espionage, the elimination of competitors, often former partners, and in targeted clashes of small groups of corporate mercenaries, envoys. Despite the fact that such things happen in the shadows, they often determine the birth, change, or disintegration of the synchroners. 5 central corporations that make up SynthCorp and 12 smaller ones are in a state of unstable equilibrium, just like humanity as a species. This is the world in which this story begins. Chapter 1. Miro on this day, like yesterday, and the day before yesterday, and many days before that, Miro woke up to the voice of the news program host. Following the sound, whose volume gradually increased, colors appeared before her eyes. At first dull, then increasingly bright and clear. Initially indistinguishable blotches gradually started to resemble human silhouettes. The alarm went off exactly at 6 in the morning. First, the sound came on. After 2 minutes, the sound became louder. After another 2 minutes, colors began to appear. Exactly at 0607, both the visual and audio plugins were fully operational. Miro almost immediately turned off all the alarm plugins, which only required her to shift her gaze to the red symbol in the lower left corner of her field of view. Today's broadcast was not the most suitable for starting a work shift. In complete silence, she began to dress leisurely, but her imagination, without the involvement of the neural interface, began to recall the intrusive voice of the host and the unpleasant visual symbols that voice had commented on. It wasn't uncommon anymore, though, and she should be used to it by now. The news always spoke in general terms. Victim on level 3. Traces of brief resistance. Investigators are establishing the possibility of a sexual motive. The victim and the perpetrator could have belonged to different strains. But even this was enough for Miro's imagination to start attacking her with the most vivid and frightening images. It was such a pity that the autonomous activity of the nervous system couldn't be turned off like sensory interfaces. There were still no buttons in the subconscious, and the subconscious was ruthless to her. A terrifying figure approached closer. Pale bluish skin, thin and long, spider-like arms, a sharp, stone-carved predatory face. One hand gripped her throat, and Miro felt that soul-chilling, paralyzing fear. The brain already knew what would happen next, and before death, it would do you one last favor. It would seem as if none of this was real, as if it was all a horrible dream, and you would wake up soon. But you wouldn't wake up. The quiescent strain had already diverged so much from the others that sexual intercourse with a quiescent without dimorphization was impossible. To be precise, one of the partners simply wouldn't survive. Many quiescents who weren't born under one of the central quint's crests had at best only heard of such a procedure, especially if they came from megacity of corporation whose synchroners are in unstable stages. Rumors circulated that quiescents from unstable regions, especially if they attacked the experientia strain, would tear pieces of flesh from the victims while they were still alive. In a way, this could even be called merciful blood loss, hastened death. Of course, quiescents weren't a strain of criminals and rapists, and those born under the crests of the central quint could be found on any level. Crimes occurred at all levels, committed by anyone and against anyone. Mentioning a person's strain in that context was unacceptable. It didn't break the unity and genetic diversity law, but it was considered extremely bad form and could significantly harm career prospects and consequently socialization in general. And yet, every time Miro heard news like this, it was as if she felt what had really happened. Miro knew it was very wrong to think that way. From childhood, she had been taught that every strain was equal to another, and the strength of humanity lays in diversity and mutual complementarity. Just on the street, they would embrace each other by the shoulders, touch foreheads, and then sing in a loud, drawn-out manner. Many found this melody beautiful, but the low throat singing and the smooth synchronous movements of such a large group of people performing a strange and incomprehensible ritual caused Miro's heart to race. And Miro knew for certain that the person mentioned in the news was one of them. Before transitioning to the new corporation, the young man had been surrounded predominantly by members of his own strain. The megacities of unstable corporations often couldn't achieve the necessary strain diversity. In the megacity of Centaurium, he had almost for the first time encountered people who differed from him much more than anyone he had met before. And when he first saw a woman of the Experientia strain, it took his breath away as if he had been punched in the stomach. In a way, she was just as much a woman as quiescent women, but as it seemed to him, with exaggerated feminine features. Her skin was light brown and appeared so soft that it incited a desire to touch it. Her unnaturally large brown eyes with long black eyelashes, despite covering almost their entire bodies with clothing, compared to the women of his strain, Experientia's breasts, waist, and hips all seemed exaggeratedly large and as if sculpted from delicate, airy dough. But the strongest sensation was the smell. It seemed so intense that the quiescent ceased to see and hear, drowning in a sea of this scent. And thus, being engulfed by a whirlpool of such strong emotions, Quiescent could not believe that before him was a living being with the same feelings and emotions as his own, that it was also a human, capable of feeling joy and pain. They seemed like artificially created dolls, made for pleasure, for his pleasure. Miro looked like one of those dolls, and for some reason she knew for sure that these were precisely the thoughts in the minds of the Quiescents who met her gaze. And Miro was ashamed of such her thoughts. Guide to Neurobiology, Psychopharmacology, and Pathoneurology for 8 to 11 semesters. Rank 2. Level M3F, approved by the High Council for Junior and Mid-Level Scientific Personnel Training. Specialization: Cross-strain DNA crossing. Clearance: TEAD-18. Megacity 7, Centaurium Corporation. Year: 280. The basis for classifying modern Homo strains are hyperbolized DNA alleles. It is hypothesized, word highlighted, that the cause of these segments' emergence was the removal of recessive, above the word recessive added, weak, gene alleles while retaining the dominant, above the word dominant added, strong alleles. The complication in zygote formation, above the word zygote added, first stage of the embryo, of repaired DNA, added, DNA of humans who underwent purification from problematic and junk genes. By the end of the 22nd century, these constituted 80% of Earth's population, led to the predominance in the population of individuals whose parents' DNA matched in both, presence of dominant alleles and the absence of corresponding recessive ones. The period of phenotypic semi-expression, added, time needed for the twofold enhancement of the ability encoded by the gene, for most hyperbolized alleles is 2 to 3 generations. The time from the first merging of mutually enhancing DNA to the appearance of offspring, with the first manifestation of the phenotype determining the homostrain. Added, a specific strain abilities for most hyperbolized alleles is equal to the period of semi-expression. The foundations and principles of the physiological characteristics of homostrains of the second tertia. Quiescent, quiescentit modus. Members of this strain possess the ability, with varying degrees of accuracy, to determine the emotional background of one or a group of people and the dynamic changes of this background. Transvision. Some members of the strain can develop this skill to such an extent that, in certain contexts, they can determine the probable actions and action chains of a selected person at a distance of up to 70 meters, though the actual distance may be greater. The presumed physiology of the skill suggests that the strain has heightened olfactory sensitivity to certain components of human secretions, particularly to metabolites of hormones, neurotransmitters, and other biologically active substances that may be present in sweat and other secretions. The exact list of substances to which quiescents may be sensitive is unknown, but it reliably includes the metabolic products of the dopamine, serotonin, and norepinephrine systems. There have been isolated cases where members of the quiescent strain were able to recount the abstract thought processes of another person. Currently, there is insufficient data to reliably confirm or refute such abilities. The earliest manifestation of transvision is possible during the period of sexual maturity, 25 years for the quiescent strain. Social restrictions. According to the Centaurium's legal framework, from the age of 22, all members of the strain are required to undergo conscious reduction training in the frontal cortical areas of the brain that control transvision. The inability to control deactivate transvision at the onset of sexual maturity can affect the mental health of the strain member. Such episodes are observed among quiescent members arriving in Centaurium from unstable regions of the solar system. Regardless of age, all members of the quiescent strain arriving in Centaurium from other corporations' megacities must undergo mandatory testing for the ability to control transvision and subsequent training if necessary. This rule does not apply to citizens of the CQ, Central Quint, corporations. Specialized training in conscious control over transvision is not mandatory and is determined by corporate status. Experientia creatoris. Members of this strain can enhance or weaken the emotional responses of an individual or group of people within a distance of up to 30 meters. Heteroprojection. This ability can be applied to positive and neutral effects. Cases of enhancing negative effects have not been described. There have been isolated cases where members of the Experientia strain encouraged specific actions in the influence object. Confirmation or refutation of such abilities is impossible due to insufficient data. Physiological basis. Poorly studied. It is presumed that the physiological basis is linked to the ability of Experientia strain members to release substance into their bloodstream that are chemically similar to certain hormones and neurotransmitters but have no effect on the strain member themselves. The mechanism of selective influence on a specific person in a group is unknown. The age of skill manifestation coincides with the onset of sexual maturity and is 32 years. Social restrictions. From the age of 29, all members of the Experientia strain must undergo mandatory training to reduce the activity of the frontal lobe areas of the brain associated with heteroprojection. All strain members arriving in Centaurium megacities from other regions must undergo a test for the ability to consciously control heteroprojection with subsequent training if necessary. This rule does not apply to citizens of the Central Quint corporations. Intendit quae intendit bene. One of the more recent Homo strains and the youngest of the second Tertius strains. Approximate manifestation date, the late 23rd century. Foot. It is recently hypothesized that the strain is much older as its abilities manifest only as a result of interaction with the localizer. Unlike other strains, the inequalities may manifest at an age. Miro didn't find out at what age intended skills could manifest, because the accidental synchronization was interrupted. The student sitting opposite had left the transporter, and the girl immediately lost interest, which had suddenly arisen when her not-too-expensive sensor accidentally picked up information from an even cheaper student storage device. Although even if she had read to the end, it probably wouldn't have stayed in her mind, and she wouldn't have understood what she had read. No, theory wasn't her thing, but she was good at practice. Miro loved her job. Young woman looked through the transparent floor of the transport module and saw 3 large domes of the University of Natural Sciences and Bioengineering, the largest in Megacity 7. The domes symbolized Jupiter, Mars, and Venus, the 3 planets colonized by humans. Miro liked the look of the university, mostly because it reminded her of 3 scoops of ice cream. 3 huge scoops, shimmering with holographic images in a tall bowl on several wide columns, at the base of which, like a waterfall of cubes, flowed numerous chains of DNA. Half a block walking after exiting the module, and Miro ran her hand over the holoshield of a large door twice her height. It slowly and silently opened. There was always a very unnatural and interesting feeling due to the mismatch of one action to another. A barely noticeable finger movement shifted the massive door, made of material imitating wood, which looked more like the gates of an ancient fortress than the entrance to the Center for Psychocognitive Support, Control, and Correction. Upon entering, Miro launched the workgroup greeting script. In response, Visual Plugin reflected a dozen images with greeting symbols from her sector colleagues. At her locker, she put on soft, less attractive but more practical, compared to her high heels, shoes, and swapped her personal localizer for the corporate one. The synchronization on the latter was slightly higher, 39%, compared to 31% on her own. In any case, the threshold level for her position was 25%, which was quite high in average. As usual, Miro exchanged a friendly glance with Ray. Ray, sitting at the desk opposite, put a bit more into her smile than just a colleague's greeting, but Miro either didn't notice or chose not to notice how often Ray looked at her with her large and unusually green, as for an Experientia, eyes. Of course, Ray couldn't have imagined that someone might use heteroprojection on her in such a place. Besides being the obvious fact that it was unethical, sensors strictly monitored any brain activity patterns related to the use of strain-specific abilities in prohibited areas. Ray was indeed surprised when, upon first seeing Miro 2 years ago, her copulation cycle unexpectedly and earlier than it should shifted towards a partner with a female hormone pheromone profile. She chalked it up to stress. A couple of times over coffee, Ray would casually talk about genital dimorphizations she had undergone as if she was talking about new manicure. Among all strains, Experientia usually began dimorphization procedures the earliest. Naturally, this was largely a matter of financial standing, but those who could afford it usually aimed to try out all the basic genital patterns within the first year of reaching the privileged, but she still underwent the procedure every few years, mostly when there was a release of the new Cygene variations. Ray preferred their products over those from her native Centaurium. Although Cygene wasn't part of the CQ, using Cygene Bioengineers services was considered a mark of good taste among the informed. Unfortunately for Ray, Miro apparently didn't know this. Ray often tried to subtly find out what genital pattern Miro currently had, but Miro always listened with interest, sometimes even asked questions, which especially encouraged Ray, but never shared anything about herself. Thus, she didn't know even that much. By external signs and evidently by birth, Miro was a woman and had a female hormone pheromone profile. Ray herself was also a woman by birth and had recently updated her masculine genital pattern to a bimasculine one. She always only underwent genital dimorphizations and never full masculinization or quasi-masculinization. Today, as always, Miro responded to Ray's greeting with a brief smile and nod before, almost immediately, turning her attention to the work holoshield. Her shift began at 9, and the first 5 requests were already waiting for review. Overall, the day proceeded quite typically for her. The synchronization level never dropped below 33%. The tasks were manageable. 3 suicide attempts, 2 dying patients, 2 relatives of the dying, 5 episodes of adolescent depression, all recurrences, 3 divorce cases, 7 cases of professional burnout. In all cases, the main problem was a drop in the effective synchronization of the localizer by 15–20% from the maximum possible. Only one task seemed interesting to Miro. At first glance, it was just another overworked engineer, but she timely noted the range from which the subject's synchronization levels had dropped, from 64 to 62%. Moreover, the task was marked as high priority. The first thing that should have caught her attention was subject's extremely high initial level. Generally, the requests Miro handled involved subjects with synchronization levels of around 40–50% at most. These were usually various types of engineers, from genital plugin developers to housing module planners, mid-level managers, and many others whose work required synchronization levels around 20–30%, including Miro herself. It could be that someone from the support sector where Miro worked was responsible for her localizers. Optimal synchronization. Most of the time, Miro corrected minor errors and referred cases requiring serious intervention to narrow specialists. But over 60%? This was for her. Even more concerning was that the system identified the drop as critical. For Miro, A 2% drop was less than the margin of error. Her personal localizer's accuracy was plus minus 3% and 1.5 for corporate. In any case, Miro followed the protocol strictly. She determined whether this was a result of a system error. There was no error, and a repeated scan showed the same level of decline. Fluctuations in the activity of basic vital centers both at the cortex and subcortex levels showed no traces of chemical or radiation exposure. There were also no traces of illegal programs and devices usage. Miro performed the same procedure as recommended in such cases at 10 different time segments defined by the system. Everything was clean. Even too clean, even and stable. The subject she was reviewing resembled an expensively built and flawlessly operating mechanism whose efficiency had slightly decreased. In any case, everything was done correctly, and if the system deemed this decrease as critical, she had no choice but to report the work done and forward the task to medical expertise. Miro didn't have the clearance to correct subjects with initial synchronization above 50%. In this case, her task was reduced to a simpler order, but she performed such tasks well. Of course, she was curious about who it might be, perhaps someone close to one of the central councils, or even a council member, or maybe an envoy. Whoever it was, Miro will never find out. In this task, almost all information, including the type of activity, was anonymized, and randomization and anonymization of subjects were of paramount importance in the Center for Psych-Cognitive Support, Control, and Correction. Nevertheless, even without this knowledge, Miro liked knowing that she was helping people, which meant they would better perform their corporate tasks. And therefore her native Centaurium, one of the 5 corporations of the CQ, would function and successfully compete. On her way home, the 3 ice cream balls of the university, over which the transport module passed, significantly lost their ability to attract the eye in the evening twilight, compared to the aesthetic, and especially advertising. Holograms that had come to life. As for the latter, it can be said that marketing designers faced a serious challenge. It wasn't enough to create a memorable color combination and an interesting slogan. To attract and be remembered, at least in the moment, an advertising hologram had such 22nd century artists as Alan W. and Amy Neo, not to mention Daniel Pereira. At least, as long as municipal authorities paid for the aesthetic holograms of high level. It's not hard to guess that corporations could use this to their advantage. Perhaps the most famous case was 5 years ago, when a promotional campaign for the new recreational localizer model from Universe United coincided with launch of high-level aesthetic holo, conquering Jupiter Korsakov. Municipal aesthetic centers of most of Centaurium's megalopolises done this, including Megacity 7. Residents were surprised, to say the least, that the authorities decided to launch a museum hologram of such status to decorate the megalopolises during a period with no significant dates, except for the release of the latest localizer model from Universe United at that time. CQ corporations had quotas obligating them to give each other the opportunity to conduct advertising campaigns for other corporations in their megalopolises, but no one from outside could regulate what specific aesthetic holograms a corporation could use in its megacities, and for how long. For several months, residents of almost all levels of Megacity 7 observed panoramic scenes of how the first atmosphere generators descended from the sky onto the surface of the gas giant. How thousands of brave colonizers, sacrificing themselves, managed construction drones in deadly conditions. Because 100 years ago, a construction drone operator couldn't control the construction process from the Earth or any other space station by pressing buttons, but had to be directly at the operation site. Of course, most interest was attracted by scenes where thousands of transport and escort ships from the 5 corporations, which would later form the CQ, were scattering across the already developed parts of the solar system with the first containers of Centaurium. It is said that sales of the new Universe United localizer model that year were 7% lower than the previous model's launch year. But the aesthetic holograms this evening were nothing special, and Miro's gaze fell on a massive blue canvas stretching across the block. It depicted a blue, cloudless, transparent sky. merging with the deep blue sea, and a distant ancient sailing ship appeared. The ship was from the times when people had not yet explored every corner of their own planet. The sails on its 3 tall masts were golden, and the ship itself as if it also was made of gold. As the ship appeared on the horizon and drew closer, its outline began to resemble a predatory bird swooping down its prey. Following the logo, the name Burana Magna Corporation appeared at the bottom. The hologram showed a first-person view, and the viewer flew through the levels of the megapolis. The city changed rapidly as if time-lapse photography. In mere seconds, new skyscrapers appeared, bridges were built, and entire levels expanded. It felt as if you were not just flying through space, but also moving at great speed through time. At certain moments, the camera would stop and focus on brief episodes of random people life, though it was clear that the advertisement targeted middle-class consumers. Miro liked the video sequence and connected to it directly. The background music had simple ethnic motifs, setting a calm tone, more to soothe than to motivate any active action, which was very fitting for the evening time. First, the camera paused on a group of people, who seemed to be gathering for a fun evening. They laughed, each wearing a thin strip of a disc localizer. This season, many corporations were producing minimalist-style products. Next, a group of students in a university library, each with the same disc. Then, several happy families. Another fly-through of several levels, and on an open terrace of an office building, presumably on the 5th level, stood a group of people in formal suits with localizers of the same shape. The music quieted, and a male and female voice alternated speaking. A multifunctional localizer for all ages and types of brain activity, for leisure and work. High synchronization rate and increased precision in targeting the necessary brain areas. Scenes of everyday life faded into the background and blurred slightly, while a semi-transparent image of a human brain with a new model of the localizer appeared in the foreground. Barely noticeable light indicators on the device changed color to the music and synchronized with them. 3-dimensional neural networks of different colors lit up inside the brain, intertwined with each other. Localizer BM12J by Burana Magna Corp. We use the most precise maps of functional activity and new technology for synchronous activation of mutually reinforcing cerebral networks. You get the maximum efficiency from your brain, regardless of what you're doing. Our unique feature, reducing the activity of antagonist networks, allows you to gain additional efficiency without power consumption. Then the camera flew into the brain and began moving even faster between the glowing nerve cell extensions of various colors. Where cells connected, a bright silver light shone. The flight speed kept increasing, and at some point, almost imperceptibly to the viewers, they found themselves not inside the brain, but within an interplanetary corporate network, connected by endless streams of transport modules and ships of various purposes. The product is certified for use in any point of the solar system. For a while longer, the music played, and the advertisement took the viewer at high speed through corporate megacities in various parts of colonized space. As the music almost faded, the image blurring began to vaguely resemble the outlines of nude bodies in dark blue tones. During smooth movements of the curves, simultaneously reminiscent of silhouettes of numerous human bodies of varying degrees of masculinity and femininity, a voice almost whispered. BM12J by Burana Magna has a special synchronization mode with peripheral neural tissues, which we use for intimate normalization purposes. She continued watching commercial after leaving the municipal transport. Perhaps it was because the image of happy families were some of the most frequent scenes in the commercial. Miro had no memory of her own family and did not feel any negative emotions about it. On the contrary, she found it interesting to observe groups of people united by genetic ties and attributing special, almost sacred significance to it. It seemed unnatural to her, but she understood that, from the majority's point of view, something was wrong with her. The commercial was ending. Miro, without finishing, interrupted the synchronization due to a strange feeling of being watched. In fact, it seemed that she had been waiting for this moment, whatever the reason. This time, Miro took anew. Route. Something urged her to walk, and she followed this unusual desire without doubts. She turned a bit earlier than usual to bypass her block from the other side, but due to renovation work in that area, she had to walk further than initially planned. At a certain point, residential buildings gave way to rows of blocked vertical pipes, probably intended for Centaurium transport. The tubes rose from the ground, resembling closely planted tree trunks, and twisted more as they approached the transition to the next level. The visual again of her neurosensor highlighted a warning about a high level of antisocial activity in the current location. Following the warning were audio and visual recommendations urging her to leave the area. Miro lowered the sound and contrast of the interface and peered into the suddenly appearing metallic jungle in front of her. It seemed that one of the pipes started moving. In the darkness, a silhouette of a person emerged, tall with a sharp face and thin, long limbs. They seemed unnaturally thin, but as soon as the pale fingers gripped Miro's wrist, she immediately felt an unusual strength as for such thin hand. She screamed and the other hand grabbed her shoulder, first pulling her sharply closer, and then pushing her forcefully to the ground. The attacker stood still for a few seconds. In the dim light, his pale face looked marble-like. It expressed ferocity and simultaneously some bewilderment, which, however, quickly drowned in his furious eyes and twisted malicious grin. The person pounced on Miro, tearing at her clothes. He fussed a lot and sometimes waved his hands chaotically, but was getting closer to his goal. Strong, firm fingers tore her underwear like paper. When only scraps of her corporate blouse and one shoe remained on Miro, as the other had came off when she fell, the person grabbed her throat to silence her and wriggled, pulling down his pants. But at that moment, the expression of bewilderment appeared on his face again. He squeezed her throat even tighter but felt strong resistance. The almost naked body, which appeared soft as cotton, felt like sandpaper to the touch. His gaze fell on the thin hairs on Miro's body, which stood on end as if from fear, but looking closely, he saw that these hairs were piercing his skin, with tiny drops of clear liquid at their tips, which was likely already in his blood. He might have been much more surprised to see that the naked person beneath him lacked any familiar primary sexual characteristics, but at that moment, the neurotoxin began to take effect, causing his already strong heartbeat to become even more palpable. It seemed that the drums started pounding in his temples. The feeling of animalistic lust gave way to an emotion he hadn't felt in years. Probably not since he'd been transferred to the Centaurium after the reintegration of his home metropolis. It was a sense of panic that only intensified as the urge to run collided with the impossibility of even moving. And Miro felt his chilling fear, for it was she who had created that emotion in her attacker's mind. The roles of hunter and prey had switched in a matter of seconds. The man wheezed quietly, kneeling. Miro looked at him and lightly pushed to the ground with her plump, naked foot. He appeared to her as a creature without self-conscious. At best, it possessed the consciousness of an insect, and she found it fun to tear off its strange long and thin limbs. Miro watched quiescent, seeing and feeling the blood pulse through his body. She knew it was wrong to place one strain above another and felt ashamed of her thoughts, but her heart began to beat faster as she imagined that soon, when the artificially maximized blood pressure will saturate the bone marrow of her prey with oxygen, she would rip out his sternum and split it in half to suck out the contents. Before these thoughts could fully play out in her mind, Miro was already plunging her thin fingers into the chest of the wheezing, bubbling man. Her sharp nails sliced through skin, muscles, and ligaments like a razor until they reached the sternum. Anyone else would have died from shock, but the toxin kept life in the body and consciousness in the mind. The drumming of the ever-accelerating heartbeat was growing along with the sensation of hellish pain. Miro made a movement with her hand that seemed to require no effort. The ribcage cracked like a bundle of dry branches, and the sternum with several rib fragments appeared in Miro's hands. Paradoxically, the still living man watched as the naked girl, whose flesh he wanted to was now in the most literal sense enjoying his flesh. As before, Miro did not fully understood what was happening. She simply followed a program that seemed prescribed to her. Everything felt so natural that she did not want to resist her desires. A sense of indescribable pleasure filled her body as stem cells from the bone marrow, saturated with oxygen a few seconds ago, entered her organism. Miro was not a wild animal, nor was she. She was completely aware of her actions. She understood that what was happening should be horrifying, but the only discomfort she felt was realizing that she found nothing horrific about it. She was simply doing what she was supposed to do. After finishing with the sternum bone, Miro squatted over the writhing man. Eyes and mouth were wide open in pain and terror. A hope for death flashed in pain and neurotoxin-clouded mind, but unfortunately his tall and once strong body with unnaturally long limbs still contained many large bones rich in stem cells. And he would live as long as possible. His last minutes would be spent to make him a living pump to maintain the oxygenation of the cells that Miro wanted to consume. All this time, Miro continued to cry and scream, creating vocal vibrations meant to enhance the activity in the necessary areas of her victim's brain, complementing the neurotoxin's effect. From the outside, it seemed as if she was mocking her victim, mimicking its death cries of pain. To the chairman of the Council on Economic Growth and Social Monitoring, Kogan MN, from the head of the second department of the Institute for the Study and Integration of Human and Other Hominid Strains, Melnick AV, scheduled report on Project S10. In accordance with our observations and data obtained from reliable sources, I take the responsibility to state that with a high degree of probability, signs of the presence of a Homo strain, previously unclassified in our data banks, have been detected in at least 3 corporations of the Central Quinta. The probability of the presence of this new strain in other corporations, both stable and unstable, is also considered non-zero, but I cannot make more precise assumptions based on the available data. General characteristics of the strain: biological integration potential, extremely high. Biological disintegration potential, highest. Current level of social integration, stable at levels 3 to 5. Current antisocial potential, high, stable, selective. Additional information and clarifications. We have gathered sufficient evidence to assert that previously observed episodic cases can now be defined as a trend. The new strain shows significantly lower DNA homology with any known strains. A unique feature is that the strain does not exhibit sexual dimorphism in terms of hormonal profile. It resembles female by hormone pheromone profile but reproduces through parthenogenesis. We also hypothesize that due to the special connection between the reproductive digestive systems, the strain can integrate the genome of ingested tissues into its reproductive cells, most often using bone marrow for this. The exact recombination mechanism is currently unknown, but it seems effective enough to generate variability within the population. Thus, despite parthenogenesis, the offsprings are not clones of the parent. Additionally, all those we consider victims of S10 were of the quiescent strain. Furthermore, all quiescents who encountered S10 were relocants from corporations with a high percentage of unstable synchronizers. We suspect that they either did not know how or did not consider it necessary to reduce the intensity of their transvision, making them easily susceptible to S10's influence, as the latter likely has abilities similar to the homostrain experientia. Unfortunately, our sensors and those of other corporations do not detect the brain activity specific to S10. Based on our data and considering the following facts: 1. S10 activity has not shown a tendency to increase populationally over the past 12 years. Despite the high antisocial potential caused by S10 is within the margin of error. I consider it necessary to continue surveillance and not interfere of the strain to further collect information. I also recommend using part of the collected information for potential information exchange with the corporations Universe United and Centaurium. Signature seal. Shakti read aloud and looked up at the heavy-set man across the table with her large brown eyes, tucking a strand of dark hair behind her ear with ring finger. Without the taking eyes off the relief on the ceiling and leaning back in his chair, Kogan took a deep drag from the hookah, causing his already massive barrel chest to swell like a small dirigible looming over the wide desk. He held in his lungs for a few seconds and made several quick eye movements up and to the side, adjusting the volume of nicotine-neutralizing substances that his artificial superliver glands produce to metabolize the toxin entering the bloodstream. "And what do you think?" he asked, drawing out the words, and, straightening in his chair, turned to face the dark-skinned woman in a strict suit with a neatly gathered high hairstyle. "I see no reason to doubt Mount Melnick's recommendations," Shakti replied dispassionately, maintaining her expression and strictly formal tone. "I know all about Melnick's recommendations. He'd keep observing and observing until he had the full picture, but we don't want it to end up like in the joke where we know everything and can do everything, only it's too fucking late." Kogan set the inhalation tube aside, unbuttoned the top button of his shirt, and giving his voice a maximally informal tone, repeated, "I'm asking what you think." Shakti accepted the suggestion to slightly lower the formality, and in a somewhat cooler voice that more reflected her temperament, replied, "I think nature has given us a cleaner, purging our ranks of dead weight." "Oh, I see," Kogan grinned crookedly. "I thought so, all you experientia are the same." Vengeful hierarchists, Kogan chuckled deeply again, trying to add a touch of irony to his words. "Even if this S10 has anything in common with you, it's definitely not experientia. And who knows what it considers dead weight." Shakti slightly raised her chin and turned to Kogan in profile, knowing that she looked even more imposing from that angle. Huge Male looked at her for a minute, then rose from his chair with an agility that was surprising for someone of his size. Despite his excess weight, the fine features of his face and relatively long arms compared to his body revealed him as a quiescent. Clacking his heels on the parquet, he walked a few meters along the massive oak table, which hovered in the air on a magnetic cushion and divided the office in half from the panoramic window to the entrance doors. He approached Shakti closely, placed one hand on the table next to her hand, and almost pressing his cheek to hers, quickly dictated, "Permission to observe confirmed. Will hold off on. Information exchange. Get Melnick to see me in the next few days, along with the other heads of departments whose reports we reviewed today. Pick a less busy day. We will have a lot of important decisions to make." He paused and continued in a slower tone. "I think our time is one of great changes." He looked at Shakti and adjusted the strand of hair that again had fallen over her eyes. Without turning towards Kogan, whose breath she could feel on her skin, Shakti replied, "The ancients wished their enemies to live in the time of great changes." Her voice remained cold and impartial, with only a slight blush on her chocolate-colored skin, revealing any excitement. "Unlike the ancients, we have more levers of the control over reality." Kogan emphasized the word control and placed his thumb on Shakti's chin, just below her full lips painted black. Instead of replying, Shakti bit the tip of his thumb, still staring straight ahead and not changing her stern expression. Meanwhile, several sensors around the room detected brain activity associated with heteroprojection. Without removing the thumb from her mouth, Kogan took a deep breath and inflated to the size of a dirigible again. At the same time, sensors of a different color reported the use of transvision. Goosebumps ran up his arm as Shakti met his gaze. He realized she had recently undergone genital dimorphization, and her pattern was now defined as thrimasculine, with a model perfectly tailored to his. The tip of a long nail lightly pricked broad chest, as if giving a command to lie down. Kogan looked at Shakti's small index finger with a manicure painted in a dynamic fractal pattern, and unbuttoning his shirt, sprawled on the table. Lifting her skirt and freeing her legs, Shakti slowly reached for the button on his trousers. From the high ceiling, a relief of 5 faces merging into one, as if it were one large 5-faced head, looked down silently at them. For almost 70 years, the 10 pairs of eyes belonging to the first 5 founders of the Central Quint had watched over what happened in one of the main halls of Burana Magna Corporation. Outside the panoramic window, the center of human civilization at the beginning of the 24th century, SyncCorp continued to grow, adding new levels, becoming increasingly complex with transportation networks, accepting and releasing thousands of lives every day. Chapter 2. Envoy's 6th Synchroner of Saigon Corporation. Station Bara. Venus. Overseer Zind began his report. The primary objective of the operation was to resolve the instability in the main Antracryo 8 synchroner. It is the 4th level synchroner, which includes 2 megacities belonging to Antra Corporation and 2 belonging to Cryo 8 Corporation. We have been cooperating with Cryo 8 in this conflict for some time, and through intermediaries, received the information that primary concords of Antra's megacities wanted to end the confrontation and surrender, but they needed a formal pretext to get approval from their corporation's higher council. They secretly provided coordinates of the 10 lower-level concords of their megacities, whose removal was supposed to end the conflict. To complete the objective, it was decided to eliminate this 10 beta-level concords. After that, alpha concords of the Antra megacities could then request evacuation due to the inability to continue active military resistance and recognize the megacities' transition under Cryo 8's governance. But, for some reason, Overseer Zind, the outcome is different from what you expected. Zind looked up at the 4 tall columns surrounding him with a half-circle. Giant-sized holographic figures of Saigon Highest Council stood like animated statues. Members of the Concoul, of course, were not present in person in the Hall of Overseers on one of their corporation's peripheral megacities. And yet, replied Zind, a primary objective has been completed and the conflict has ended. He made a pause, waiting for other comments. The holograms remained silent and Overseer Zind continued his report. Concern was that Cryo 8 systematically ignored our warnings, that among their envoys, working on the mission, there might be those who had contacts with the Ursa Corporation. Interests of the First Quina Corporation, Ursa, in this area from ours, and therefore from the interests of Cryo 8. 24 Earth hours before the Overseer's Zind report. Unstable Antracryo 8 synchroner on the station Barra. He is definitely from Saigon. Look at his movements. What's wrong with them? The third was answering with long delays, staring strictly ahead. He didn't allow the conversation, which he didn't see much point in, to occupy any significant part of his attention. I worked with Saigon, continued the second. He is definitely not one of them. Third gave a careless nod, as if reminding that he had nothing more to say, and raised his hand, signaling to stop. Second continued talking to himself. I worked with Saigon. They are undoubtedly good, but their movements lack fluidity. Moreover, he took out 2 of Antra with their own impulses. I still don't understand what that was. It didn't look like reflector, and it was precise. The shots didn't just ricochet from the field, but neutralized those who sent them. And the movements, Saigon movements, aren't so smooth. They are quick, yes, and accurate, but there's a certain carelessness in them. It feels like the basal ganglia were not changed where it doesn't affect accuracy and speed. This one is more like someone from the centrals. Take the Central Quinta, for example. Whether Ursa or Modus, or anyone from them, they always follow the rule a good show is worth more than money. They might even sacrifice accuracy, but everything will look beautiful. Every movement seems to be done with 1 millimeter accuracy. Accuracy of Envoy F is definitely fine. You saw it yourself. Shortly replied third, and turned back to where first and fourth were walking. He gave a short nod, passing the command received from F, and 4 matte gray figures, covered by camouflage matrices, silently merged into the flesh of the wounded city, from which the unpowered veins of electromechanical systems occasionally glimmered. Using communication in these positions was impossible. Antro scanned every inch. Transmitting a voice message at such a distance would be equivalent to launching a dozen signal impulses, and you could launch them right into your head. The result would be almost the same, only the visual dimorphization of third envoy, reinforced by a localizer with focal adjustment of the occipital lobes, allowed him to distinguish F's signals at a distance of more than 2 kilometers in the dense construction of what was once the 7th level of megacity. Starting from the 5th level to the last, the 9th, 2 neighboring megacities of the Antra and Cryo 8 corporations essentially merged into one. Residential quarters and control towers under the red and blue crests were mixed like cards of different suits in one deck, pulled tight by the belts of transport routes. We can move, said third, turning off the matrix, and giving first and fourth command to close the distance. 4 envoys formed a tight circle and stood motionless for several minutes. Only the quick movements of their pupils and changes in size and color of the iris indicated the exchange of collected information. Any questions on the results of the exchange? Third envoy broke the silence. There were no questions. Excellent, he summarized. So our plans for the evening. We can end this all tonight, as we have permission to remove the beta-level leadership. Apparently, the Antra top brass have leaked everyone under them, and they need a formal excuse to ask their own leaders for permission to evacuate, after which all 4 megacities will be taken over by us, under Cryo 8's control. What's with indirect losses? Fourth asked. Regarding indirects. A clear directive has been given not to escalate, continued Third Envoy. The advantage of escalation is currently on our side. If we exceed the limit in this sector, Antra will receive permission from the Council to increase the limit of indirect losses on our side up to 20% of the sector they are working on. That will greatly change the balance, and then it is not clear who will need to request evacuation permission. Therefore, the situation is extremely serious. Now, for those who don't remember, thanks in part to our efforts, we have a 10% limit. Their limit is 5%. For the details, 2nd and 4th will place markers at the transition points to the 6th and 8th levels. You have up to 2 hours for this. By this time, Envoy F should return with a more or less complete picture of the area where the targets are located. We already have information about the indirect targets. It seems that Antra apparently did not lie, and the information about the targets corresponds to reality. But we need a final picture. The quarters we have to work in are filled with indirect targets, so First Envoy and I will be calculating possible indirect losses at this time, and we will also take care of Vector Bio. Our indirects are Antras, clarified Fourth Envoy. First and Second exchanged grins. What's your experience? Second asked. 29th mission, Fourth replied calmly. But before that, I mostly worked with gathering information or on individual targets, without indirect damage. Where if it's not a secret? Most of the time in the Venusian megacities of Cryo 8. In this case, welcome to the party. And what got you here? Continued Second, leaning on a piece of stone slab. Personal initiative, got tired of eavesdropping on conversations through the camouflage matrix. Fourth was answering shortly, not going into details. Personal initiative is commendable. Third intervened. Regarding your question, according to the latest amendments and the current situation, there should be none of ours on this territory. Though we will not be fined by Council for our own indirect losses, there's no need to overdo it. But ours shouldn't be there? Shouldn't, but the main thing is not to overdo it. This I say in advance. First exhaled 3 rings of orange smoke, discarded a disposable neurostimulator capsule, and examining the lines of the impulse generator on his right hand, addressed Fourth. In such density and current circumstances, to determine our indirect losses, we use the 1 to 5, 1 to 10 rule. A good trade-off is 1 to 5. One target, no more than 5 are indirects. If the status of the indirect is below third, then 1 to 10 is acceptable. Fourth thought for a second, then looked at everyone in turn and nodded. Without turning off the camouflage matrix, F peeked over the edge of the stairways, ending in an abyss. The control tower, split in half, began on the 3rd level, ran all the way up, and towered above the buildings of the 9th level. Probably about 100 proton-antiproton charges collapsed almost simultaneously. The gravitational funnel at the peak of its amplitude, like a stretched spring, changed polarity and self-converted into an anti-gravitational one, again amplitude to the maximum, and again self-conversion. The effect of such charges was as if the very hand of God had grabbed the streams of matter and antimatter and shook them convulsively, trying to punch a hole in the space-time continuum. Several hundreds of such cycles, and literally in a couple of seconds, the halls of one of the main centers of Cryo 8 on Bera fell apart like the pages of an old book. These were definitely Ursa's charges. It was unlikely that Antra's engineers could calculate the combination of particles and antiparticles so precisely and even set the sequence of the reaction so that each subsequent collapse resonated with the previous one. Envoy F also knew that it was a disservice. Ursa Corporation was confident that Antra's envoys, who had never dealt with such technology, would fail to hit only targets and would exceed the indirect damage limit. After that, a fine from the Council and permission for Cryo 8 to raise Antra's indirect damage percentage to 10. And his own presence here was also a consequence of this split tower. In some places where gravitational and magnetic fields were still working due to emergency power remnants, wall fragments and modular frame pieces hung precariously in the air, as if some part of the explosion froze in time. The largest fragments, one after another, fell with a lonely crash to the lower levels at short time intervals. Obviously, the heavier ones depleted the batteries faster. It was necessary to choose the smallest, no bigger than a nut of the unna tree. They are harder to balance on, but they consume less battery and the field tension under them is higher, or at least it should be. F switched the localizer to maximum synchronization mode with the posterior columns of the spinal cord, up to 73%, greatly enhancing muscle sensitivity, and brought the synchronization of the precentral gyrus to 80% to increase push strength. But to avoid burning out his brainstem nuclei with glutamate over-release, he had to lower the parietal lobes below the critical level. To the submaximal mark, 65%, F raised the synchronization of the cerebellum by critically lowering the synchronization of the occipital lobes. The number of neurons in the cerebellum exceeds the number of neurons in the cerebrum several times, so 65% was more than enough. Envoy F worked with a new SY-12 model localizer from Saigon. As he was told, only a limited contingent of Saigon envoys worked on it. F understood that the limited contingent was limited to him. The model's distinguishing feature, among other things, was the absence of fuses at critical levels of maximization and minimization. Simply put, you could push everything to the absolute maximum, burn all the main subcortical nuclei with an enormous amount of calcium entering the neurons, and spend the rest of your life on an envoy's pension, gazing at a hologram of the spring sky, happily drooling in one of the veteran homes of the 4th or 5th level. On the other hand, you can nullify everything, including your brainstem, and pass away in a couple of seconds due to respiratory and cardiac centers failure. Envoy F found it hard to admit, but sometimes he seriously pondered which of these options to choose if the situation became hopeless. In short, the toy was not for amateurs, but F was a risk-taker. He was also reassured by the fact that unlike most envoys, he was not of an intendit, but of a quiescent homo strain, and during contact, he compensated for synchronization deficiencies by being able to feel up to 5 enemy envoys within a range of about 80 meters. Even 100% synchronization of everything aimed at improving the accuracy of pulse charges didn't guarantee success if your opponent can literally smell your thoughts half a minute ahead and knows exactly the levels of your synchronization. And now, with the SY-12 having no restrictions, it was enough to raise the necessary characteristics by 3% higher than the enemy's. Like in poker, when you can not only see your opponent's cards, but also choose any necessary card from the deck. So for the first time working with the SY-12, he felt like he had grabbed God by the beard, though he was aware of the danger of such a feeling. Of course, there was a price to pay. Like now, for such a critical increase in both muscle strength and sensitivity, he would have to move almost deaf. And for increased coordination, also blind. Melnick walked along the soft carpet of the dimly lit corridor to where a thin strip of light indicated the open door of Burana Magna Corporation highest council room. He sank into a wide chair on a magnetic cushion and, adjusting the sleeves of his black shirt buttoned at the throat, rattled a metal cufflink with a crest against the mirrored metallic surface of the table. Melnick, in the middle. To his left, almost at the end of impressively long table, sat Toichi, head of the Department of External Contacts of the corporation, EC, and to his right, at the same distance, sat Timmerman, head of the Department of Risk Limitation and Competition, RLC. The last to enter the hall and sit on the opposite side were Burov, head of the Department of Techno Research and Integration, TRI, and Thompson, head of the Department of Genetic Diversity and Equilibrium, GDE. The door closed silently behind the latter. The five exchanged glances, greeting each other with a slow lowering of their eyelids. Given the distance between the participants, this gesture might have gone unnoticed without visual demorphization. Everyone sat silently and motionlessly, leaning back in their chairs, only their pupils periodically changing size and color. Melnick was the only one who sat with his head resting on the left hand, rubbing a strand of hair between the fingers. The thoughts he was organizing now were not meant to be recorded on a third-party physical storage. One edge of the table, making a smooth curve, rose above the others. The ceiling, made of light permeable alloy, revealed a canvas of the sky. Visually, no one could distinguish it from a holographic projection. If, by some very unlikely reason, an inhabitant of the lower levels ended up on the 9th and reached the upper floors of the central tower, they would hardly be surprised by the natural sunlight, which they had never actually seen. The door opened again and a sixth person entered the hall. Everyone stood up. Unlike the five already present, the collar edge of his matte black shirt was trimmed with gold. The small crest in the form of a bird in an attacking dive on the sleeves, and at the left collarbone, was also made of gold. Kogan stood at the elevated part of the table and, placing his hand on the crest, made a greeting gesture. The five responded similarly, and each sat back in their chair. The formal introduction was automatically reproduced in the sensory interfaces. From then on, everyone spoke aloud. Concord Toichi, I think it's best to start with you. Because the issues of your competence determine the events of our near future, began Kogan. Toichi made a barely noticeable nod towards Kogan and projected a map of the solar system from his carrier onto the visualizers in the hall. Recently, our department's attention has been drawn to an economic confrontation between one of the corporations of the Central Quinta and a corporation of the Near Orbit. The duration and resource intensiveness of this confrontation takes it beyond the framework of personal relationships between the two corporations. The corporations Ursa and Saigon, in the course of their mutual opposition, have brought one of the synchroners, where 4 megacities of the two far-orbit corporations converge, into an unstable state. If I may, I want to take a moment and provide some context to the situation. Per permission granted, Concord Toichi, Kogan replied briefly. For those not immersed in the details of your department's work, you can provide an expanded version. Toichi slowly lowered his eyelids twice, looking alternately at Thompson and Melnick, and the map on the central visualizer zoomed in on Venus. The interplanetary station Bera is located 14 solar units from Venus on the second universal interplanetary axis. There are 22 megacities on the surface. 2 transit megacities belong to one of the corporations of the Central Quinta, Ursa. 8 megacities belong to the Saigon Corporation. Saigon is not part of the Central Quinta, as you know, but is one of the 6 corporations of the Near Orbit. The remaining megacities belong to the Far Orbit corporations Antra and Cryo 8. Near Orbit corporations do not have unstable synchroners, unlike Far Orbit corporations, but they have important production or regulatory centers on planets or stations with unstable synchroners. Synchroner, a group of megacities that are closely interconnected, sometimes geographically inseparable, but belong to different corporations. Near Orbit corporations serve as a kind of valve between the Central Quinta and the Far Orbit, with which the Central Quinta does not have direct contacts. The architecture of the Bera station reflects the general principle of all planets and stations with unstable synchroners. Several transit megacities of one of the Central Quinta corporations form stable synchroner with one or several near-orbit corporations. They, in turn, form stable synchroners with each other and with far-orbit corporations. Far-orbit corporations also may form stable synchroners with each other and with the near-orbit, but also have, or may potentially have, one or more unstable synchroners with each other. As a rule, the appearance of unstable synchroners is only a matter of time on planets and stations where corporations of all ranks, Central Quinta, near and far orbits, are represented. Instability. a condition in which megacities of different corporations within the territory of one synchroner, as one of the methods of competition, use forceful confrontation, from eliminating leadership elements to more large-scale actions with the disorganization of one or more levels of the megacity. The options for resolving instability can include a return to a stable state by agreement of the parties or disorganization of the synchroner to zero level, loss of synchroner status. In this case, all megacities of the synchroner come under the control of one of the corporations. The fate of the inhabitants of the megacity, whose leadership was replaced by competitors, depends on their ability to adapt to the production codex of the new leadership. In many ways, the result of stabilization depends on the interests of the central Quinta corporations in the region, as they can most influence the scale of possible forceful confrontation. A certain degree of influence is held by interested near-orbit corporations. Far-orbit corporations generally have very limited influence on the situation determining their future. If the interests of the central Quinta align with those of the near orbit, stabilization usually occurs quickly enough. In case the near orbit has interests that conflict with those of the central Quinta, due to the lack of apparent resource superiority on one side, the unstable state tends to persist for a longer time. Toichi stopped for a moment, waiting for possible questions, but the silence made him continue. Architecture and the cause of instability at the Bara station. Architecture: 2 stable second-level synchroners between the corporations Saigon and Ursa. 1 stable synchroner between Saigon and Cryo 8. 1 stable synchroner between Saigon and Antra. 1 stable synchroner between Cryo 8 and Antra. An unstable 4th level synchroner, which includes 2 Cryo 8 megacities and 2 Antra megacities specializing in low-tech component production. The remaining megacities are either unitary, zero-level synchroners, or part of stable synchroners. Cause and prerequisites of instability. For the last 3 decades, Ursa Corporation has been reducing the number of Prima Q transporters it purchases from Saigon due to a gradual transition to more modern transport modules that do not use antimatter collectors. The reduction in a Prima Q transporter purchases is not critical for Saigon, as the latter has long been modernizing its megacities to exit transporter production and switch to more high-tech products, mostly medical, artificial glands, demorphization technologies, regeneration, and neural transfer. Nevertheless, Saigon is still interested in profiting from the sale of transporters, as it needs RISAs for transition to a more technological level as quickly as possible. The Bara station is one of Saigon's important sources of income, so Saigon continues to purchase antimatter collectors from Cryo 8 and Antra, produce Prima Q transporters, and supply them to Ursa through 2 stable synchroners. However, Ursa is not interested in Saigon's rapid transition to the production of more high-tech products, as Saigon already successfully competes with the corporations of the Central Quinta, particularly in the field of genital dimorphization technologies. For this reason, Ursa is lowering the price it is willing to pay for transporters, thereby delaying Saigon's growth in this part of the solar system and gaining time to secure its market position. To maintain profits and development speed, Saigon is forced to lower the already critically low purchase price of antimatter collectors. As a result, the megacities of the Cryo 8 and Antra corporations, which had previously formed a stable 4th-level synchroner, a 4th-level synchroner includes 4 megacities, and specialized in the production of components for antimatter collectors, are forced to focus all their efforts on maximizing profits from their products on a here-and-now principle, losing opportunities to modernize production. For a long time, each corporation tried to adhere to non-violent competition methods, but at a certain point it became clear that the only way to maintain the resource influx and simultaneously modernize would be to disorganize the synchroner to zero level, centralize it under the control of one corporation, standardize production cycle, and significantly reduce workforce. All this ultimately led to the current state of instability. The conflict is reflected in the interactions of other Cryo 8 and Antra megacities both on the Bara station and at other points in the solar system, but being in a stable state, they are not interested in creating new hotspots of instability, although they may influence indirectly. The degree of indirect influence by any party in the conflict or other interested corporations is regulated by the Code of Unitary Humanity and controlled by the Solar Council, which includes representatives from all 17 corporations. Saigon sees its way out of the situation by significantly strengthening one of the sides of the conflict to bring it to a quick resolution. Ursa, in turn, is working to balance the forces and prolong the conflict. Not having a vested interest in the victory of a specific side, both Saigon and Ursa act situationally, providing assistance in the form of resources and information to both corporations. After a recent incident, when Antra exceeded the amount of possible indirect losses on the Cryo 8 side, the Council gave Saigon permission to use its envoy in the conflict zone and significantly increased the percentage of allowable indirect resource losses Anthra could suffer. What do you mean by indirect? Thompson asked while Toichi paused again to clear his throat. This means the inadvertent elimination of living targets not included in the list authorized by the Council at this stage of the confrontation. Thompson nodded. ETRI is to some extent aware of the overall situation, said Burov, bringing his hands to face and adjusting the thin frames of glasses. And I think you're about to voice what concerns us directly. That's exactly what I was about to do. The ECC Inner Council decided to provide minimal sufficient support to Saigon. To do this, a technology was transferred through a network of envoys. At all stages of the transfer, there was no mention of the Saigon Ursa conflict, and everything took place with the participation of the researchers, who mostly thought they were just having coffee at a conference. Nevertheless, Saigon's system to be efficient enough that several seemingly independent technologies were recognized, integrated, and used for the purpose for which we transferred them. Is such an impact truly minimal? Kogan interrupted, not waiting for Toichi to finish the sentence. I have more doubts about its sufficiency, but in case of failure, the likelihood of this being linked to Burana Magna is extremely low. Melnick, listening intently, nodded in Toichi's direction, expressing a desire to ask a question. Toichi responded in kind. As far as I know, you are also aware of our department's current work, and know that Strain 10 may soon require joint efforts from all the Central Quinta corporations. Why create a potentially conflictual situation, or even weaken one of the Quinta members? We are approaching this issue. Toichi made a gesture with his hand as if placing a colon. As you know, it is not the first incident of this kind. Near-orbit corporations are increasingly entering into prolonged confrontation with the Central Quinta. It is becoming apparent that the envoys of near-orbit corporations now often include hybrids of two Homo strains, significantly increasing their competitiveness. Why such hybrids do not appear in the Central Quinta corporations is not yet known, but we have concluded that we must study the effectiveness of such hybrids. And for this reason, you decided to share one of our latest technologies with them? Said Burov, who had been waiting for the right moment. We assume that if we do not respond to such trends, they will not disappear on their own. Concord Toichi wants to say, Timmerman joined the conversation, that through our joint efforts, we have assessed the risks and believe that the trend will persist, and ultimately one of the near-orbit corporations will be able to forcefully change the architecture of the Quinta. Kogan, who had been silent until then, clinked his cufflinks and placed his wide palms on the table. In that case, what is the rationale for supplying them with technologies and increasing potential danger? He asked, looking questioningly at Timmerman and Toichi. Toichi raised his index finger to forehead, signaling to Timmerman that he would explain the situation. We consider the danger not potential but certain, and we believe that the tactic of observation is not suitable here. Even without our technologies, the growth of the number of hybrids on the planet will lead to a displacement of one. And in the worst case, of all the planets of the CQ. Kogan made a short sound, devoid of any emotional coloring, but still revealing a certain uncertainty in him. Continue, Concord Toichi, Kogan said, making an encouraging gesture with his hand. Our plan of action is as follows. The issue of the sharp increase in the level of hybridization on the planets of the near orbit cannot be ignored. We deemed it necessary to enter into unregulated relationship with one of the planets of the near orbit, and, on the rights of exchange, obtain the maximum amount of information that will help us master the hybridization technology. The conflict between Ursa and Saigon is an excellent pretext for this. First, Saigon has no ties with unstable synchroners where our interests are represented, and second, the Ursa Corporation is most often an interested party in such conflicts, and sooner or later, perhaps even already, they may be the first to start contacts with the corporations of the near orbit to develop hybridization technology. Burov rubbed his forehead and said, "It may be useful to test some of our technologies in the context of interaction with hybrid strains," but he made a pause and rubbed his forehead again. But, bad feeling, that. Thompson, the head of the GDE department, and Melnick, head of the second department of the Institute for Human Strain Research and Integration, made approving gestures. Kogan again looked at Burov. Burov adjusted his glasses, glanced around at the council members, and made an uncertain approving gesture with his right hand. "Let's consider that we have made a decision," Kogan confidently concluded. "We can move on to the next issue. Project 10. Melnick plugged his carrier into the visualizer. Chapter 3. Vector BioF jumped and then jumped again. All sounds merged into an indistinct hum. Blurred silhouettes of the semi-destroyed tower occupied his field of view. He moved by memory and made long, several-meter jumps, each time landing on one leg and balancing on a springy support. As soon as the stone, fixed by the anti-gravity field, pressed into his foot, F's taut nerves slightly relaxed. Until, jump. He moved upwards to the tower's roof along directions where he remembered several potential supports to, in case one of them turned out to be unreliable. And so this time, at the calculated moment, instead of the springy resistance of a solid support in the anti-gravity field, he felt a whipping blow against his soul. A split second was enough for him to reach out his hand in the direction where, according to his memory, there was another support, and clutching a small stone in his fist, Envoy 4 hung over the abyss. The stone hardly bounced. Here the field could still support him in the air for a long time. The remaining path could be done in 2 jumps, but he would have to push off from a wide slab, which was still holding but already wobbling in the air. He had 1 attempt. The slab was large enough, and despite his blurred vision, Envoy F saw that it was still at the same place. He added 0.5% to the part of the brain responsible for the pushing force and almost nullified synchronization with the visual and auditory cortex. In complete darkness, he pulled himself up and straightened, standing on one hand with his feet in the air, pointing towards the slab. A sharp, springy movement of his left hand, and the body of Envoy F shot upwards and backwards like an arrow. In the air, F somersaulted over his head, pressed his legs to his chest, then at the right moment, his knees extended and 2 feet forcefully struck the metal slab. At that moment, the slab crashed down, but the pushing force was enough for F to do another backflip in the air and land on the solid surface of the tower roof. Catching his breath, he resynchronized the cortical areas. Vision and hearing turned. As his muscle strength and coordination decreased to normal, he bent his knees slightly and staggered under the increased weight of his body and the sudden gust of wind. His task was to determine how accurate the obtained information was. In the neighboring quarters, there should be 10 targets. Their elimination meant the end of the conflict with the Antra Corporation and withdrawal of the remaining Antra leadership. 4 megacities would completely come under the control of the Cryo-8 Corporation after one of them would be taken over by his corporation, Saigon. A stable 4th-level synchroner would be established, the Bara Station instability area would be eliminated, and Saigon Corporation would return to its original rate of production and distribution of E Prima Q. Transporters. Ursa Corporation would have no choice but to accept reality. That was the original plan and agreement between Saigon and Cryo-8. At such a height, F could launch up to 12 scanning pulses without being detected. Antra simply did not have technologies that could scan the perimeter at a height of more than 100 meters above the 9th level. F looked down and the scanner automatically gave the distance to the ground, 800 meters. These new pulse scanners, which at such a height could provide a clear picture of what was below, were also a new special toy, only for a limited number of envoys. That is, for him. 3 pulses were enough for visual interfaces to recreate a dynamic image of all the area they needed. So, on personal initiative, second envoy said as if to himself, and with one movement threw 2 laser markers at once. Small, less than palm-sized discs flew in opposite directions and clicked under the roofs of 2 buildings on opposite sides of the street. Did you see that? He suddenly shouted with childish self-satisfaction and enthusiasm. The 4th envoy involuntarily twitched the corner of his mouth in a semblance of a smile. So, you say, on personal initiative, second addressed 4th directly, meeting his gaze with a sharp, glassy look. The 4th stared back, showing no reaction. After a few seconds, he averted his eyes, took a step back, then 2 quick steps forward, pushed off the dusty road, and jumped up, grabbing with his hands a metal rod sticking out of a ruined transportation line, a meter above their heads. Gaining momentum, 4th spun around the springy metal rod, jumped up, and in the jump threw 4 discs at once, which flew in 4 different directions. In the fall, he grabbed the next similar metal rod and landed right where second was walking at that moment, raising a cloud of dust around them. It appears so, 4th replied, not catching his breath and brushing off his sleeves. I was exactly like that many decades ago. Second said thoughtfully with a nostalgic smile, looking first at the metal rods 4th had pushed off from, and then at where the 4 markers had flown. Also, by the way, like you said, was eavesdropping on conversations through the camouflage matrix. He let out a short cough-like chuckle, as if assessing 4th's sense of humor. You know, that's not so often here. Doing things on initiative. In most cases, everyone here has a little sin. If, for you, it also was a thoughtful decision, what about 1st and 3rd? What are their sins? If you want to know everything right away, you can ask them. Second envoy coughed again and paused for a couple of seconds. Although, I can tell you, but there's no secret here. 1st envoy, it's obvious, overuses stimulants a bit. 3rd, how to say it, he didn't want to play the role that circumstances demanded of him and decided to make his own theater. At least, that's how he sees it. Do you like your role? Second suddenly asked sharply again. In what sense, role? Literally. Can you tell me clearly what you're doing here? With these words, he picked up a laser marker from the ground. It seemed. One of those 4th envoy threw had not reached its target. Here, take you dropped it. 4th nonchalantly took the metal disc. Without waiting for the answer, 2nd envoy continued. I have already said, I was just like you, but after a few decades, the categoricity somehow diminishes. He paused briefly and looked around. On this stretch of road, the 6th, 7th, and 8th levels converged in one place. If they were to be slammed here, there was no better place. The markers were positioned so that any attempt at encirclement would not go unnoticed. Everyone has a place here, he continued. And the first thing you need to do is to recognize that fact and then understand what that place is, and only then you should figure out if you like your place or not. By the way, it's not as simple as it may seem at first glance. Many people have an interest in making you think you are not where you really are. I can't be deceived so easily. Easily, repaid second. Much easier than one can imagine. He switched the localizer to calculation mode and displayed on his visual interface the district map with overlaid markers. Few seconds his eyes were rapidly moving left and right, up and down, then suddenly stopped. Second envoy turned around and with one fast movement threw a metallic disc. So with a high whistle it flew right in front of the eyes of the 4th and disappeared over the horizon. That was the last, he concluded, and that is much easier than one can imagine. Second was changing the directions of his talk, so it took 4th a few moments to realize that the topic was switched back to the previous, so he didn't have a chance to reply immediately. There is no need to deceive the one you call yourself. Or, let's say, usually call yourself. Even though humans can now perceive thousands of times more information per unit of time, than in the era before genome purification and processing accuracy is even higher, you still know that you don't have the full picture. There may still be a small percentage of unknown data that would radically change the estimate of probabilities. And yet what we call intuition, or the subconscious mind, or the paleocortex, or whatever, that what gives you feeling where you are. Not the conscious data gathering, or modeling, or analysis. What you call subconscious mind uses the same input information, but uses the other ways to find an output. Not exactly there is a small thing, which is taken into account by specifically the subconscious mind. Second envoy made a pause. These are the signs, symbols, and uncontrolled responses they cause. The signs of threat and the signs of wealth, signs of pleasure and of pain. We could not get rid of that rudiment during the time of humanity genome purification, and still keep it in our genes. For some reason we still need those mechanisms from prehistoric era. When ancient pre-humans saw on the ground the tracks of the stronger animal that could eat them, at first they did not care, but when that animal ate some of them, they started to run away from those tracks without thinking. When they saw tracks of weaker animals that they could eat, at first they did not care, but when some of them died of starvation, they started to follow those tracks without thinking, like they were some guiding signs. In this circle of chasing and hiding, approaching and avoiding, humanity built civilization. But once it was built, it appeared that humans are stupid enough to believe just in symbols and signs, not taking reality into account. Billions of humans just now are taught specific associations of certain symbols with the emotions they should feel about them. So by the age when they consciously accept the crest of the corporation, you can see most of them just as the bunch of associations, or better to say, bunch of levers that one can push. Surround them with symbols associated in their minds with wealth, and they will feel happiness. Switch the symbols to those associated with suffering, and they will suffer. And it happens just in a moment, even if nothing is changed in real world. They feel what symbol commands them to feel, no matter how far it's from reality. The signs you are talking about have nothing to do with envoys, as we are the ones who create reality. We differ a lot from corpse. They just follow the signs until at the end they mostly just become what we call indirects. That's good if you understand that, and I hope you understand it to the degree you show. All of us should. I'll tell you even more. All of us here, and not just us. Antra, Saigon, and even Centaurium or Ursa. If you bring everyone to a common denominator, we are all here because at some point in our lives, there was an acute sense of discrepancy between what surrounds you, what you were told that surrounds you, and what you think should surround you. And even though there is one last question remaining, is this the final stop, or are we now at an intermediate station? Second looked at the fourth again, but with less sharpness in his eyes. Without a word, Fourth hurled the disc that the second picked up from the ground at the wall a few meters away. Now, that was the last, said the fourth. Sorry for the long talk, but you see I had a lot of time to think about that. And you probably just recently started to think about those questions. For me, that is not even a question, interrupted Fourth Envoy sharply, but immediately lowered his tone. He felt that he was revealing too much. And under a common denominator with Ursa, let alone Antra, I can't stand. In this synchroner, he added, I believe that everything is clear here. We protect our corporate codex and our crest. Fourth Envoy felt that the abrupt change in the second's tone had skillfully aroused in him a vague feeling of uncertainty that made him raise his voice. The fourth fought the urge. I'm here in the interests of Cryo 8, because Antra moved from economic competition to forceful opposition. What can be more real than that? He paused for a moment as if letting his thoughts and emotions settle. When open confrontation hadn't started yet, he continued more calmly, I worked on Venus in a stable synchroner with Antra. But when the first Antra envoys appeared in the Bara colony, I realized who was an ally, who was an enemy, and what my role here was. I left the group and applied for a transfer to an unstable synchroner. So, you like the role? I understand you, Second said thoughtfully, evaluating how truthful such idealism could be. If today we will do everything as planned, if everything will go as. Third described, Second continued in a tone suggesting it should be the last that he is going to say. And we will eliminate instability. Have you thought about other synchroners that we share with Antra? They will surely look for the ways to regain their positions. If the instability will arise, for example, Second furrowed his brow, indicating he was thinking, even on Venus. What was your previous synchroner? The ninth Venusian. Fourth replied, thinking meanwhile what was it all about. And which corporations? There are several with Cryo 5. So if, for example, Cryo 5 decides to deploy its envoys, we will need to seek support primarily from our closest neighbors, possibly even from Antra. No megacity bears responsibility for the conflicts of other megacities of its corporation. Fourth replied as if reciting lines from the Oath, a book that simultaneously served as a Bible, corporate code, and survival guide for all envoys, regardless of corporation. Moreover, our megacities do not share markets on Venus with Cryo 5, we simply share logistic routes, so your assumptions are unlikely. The fourth could not understand what the second was ultimately testing him for. At first, it seemed like a simple desire to find out more about him. These three had clearly been together for over 10 years and barely knew him. But when the second brought up topics that were not usually discussed, especially on a mission, however, he decided not to make hasty conclusions. There was still time. He needed to go through all possible scenarios from beginning to the end and calculate his actions. Until then, he will adhere to his chosen tactics and strictly follow the instructions of the Oath. I don't understand where you're leading. We can paint pictures of an imaginary future for a long time, but what happened now is that Antra instigated instability and decided to act by force. We provide resistance and will defend our markets. And it will be so in every synchroner, not just with Antra, but with anyone. Even with Cryo 5. Second looked at the fourth and, jutting out his chin and half closing the eyes, nodded encouragingly. First and third stood waiting for fourth. Second and Envoy F, assembly and preparation of the Vector Bio for operation were complete. A weapon that, depending on the settings, could be both a means of mass destruction or hit individual targets in a crowd at long range. If a living organism is imagined as a conglomerate of organs supplied by a complex system of hydraulic pumps, and which integrity is maintained by electrochemical connections, then a person in this respect is a generator of a huge number of mechanical, sound, and electromagnetic waves. These waves had characteristics common to all living things, but the more information was taken into account, the more individual the wave imprint of each living being became. Vector Bio was detecting these wave imprints. Having the wave imprints of the targets, Vector generated a combination of dynamically changing electromagnetic fields in the target area, which alternately resonated with the target's waves. If the wave imprint was set correctly, the effect on the target was similar to the effect of an invisible blender, and ideally did not affect non-targeted living beings caught in the radius of impact. Of course, 100% accuracy was unattainable. Sometimes non-targets accidentally caught under the influence of the vector could be injured if the imprint coincided to some extent. Sometimes the resonance might not be sufficient to completely eliminate the target, and it could still remain viable. All this ultimately depended on the skill of those who set up and controlled the weapon, and of course, on luck. Now the 5 envoys had to set up the weapon in such a way that in the designated area, with minimal collateral losses, they would eliminate all 10 targets. At least that was the main plan of the Cryo 8 Corporation. Information successfully gathered, formally reported Envoy F, slightly tilted his head back, and his pupils began to change color and size rapidly, as always happened when large packages of information needed to be shared. Following first and third, second and fourth stood next to him. An interactive model of the area of interest in a time frame of 48 minutes appeared in everyone's visual neurointerface. The map showed the exact location of all 10 targets and their actions. Bifurcation points, areas where actions of the targets and indirect ones went beyond the recorded timeframes, were marked. In that point system calculated possible outcomes. Each of the envoys used an algorithm different from the others, but the results of each were needed to obtain the final target parameters. First envoy used multidimensional probability analysis. He took into account the current position of the targets, Their vital parameters, typical behavior patterns, and environmental influences such as changes in temperature, humidity, and atmospheric pressure. The algorithm was built on a Bayesian network that updated the probabilities of various outcomes as new information came in. With each new input, the Bayesian network recalculated the probabilities, refining the forecasts. Third processed the information through deep learning algorithms. He used recurrent neural networks, RNN, of the long short-term memory LSTM type, focusing on processing time-varying data, particularly biological rhythms and wave imprints of targets. When properly configured, the system could predict to the minute when an object would feel hunger and how long after that it would decide to satisfy it. Each input signal was interpreted in the context of past data to create a forecast. These algorithms worked on creating thousands of parallel simulations, each modeling possible developments based on the data received from first and third. Second and fourth connected to the data exchange, processed each simulated pseudo-reality, and switched between different scenarios. In general, first created many probabilities, third narrowed them down, F's algorithm simulated these probabilities, and second and fourth worked through them to obtain the optimal time, place, and most importantly, the characteristics of the fields that BioVector should generate. All this was immediately committed to. The vector and 3 hyperbolic paraboloids initially created a barely audible but gradually intensifying hum. The entire exchange and information analysis were conducted using the power of subcortical implants and effectively did not require the involvement of conscious processes, except for switching algorithm formulas. But standing shoulder to shoulder, all 5 understood that once the calculations were completed, they would no longer need each other. In a sense, they stood, pointing weapons at each other, and the moment to make a choice was approaching. First, third, and second switched to a covert communication channel that randomly interleaved into the main stream of information and could not be decrypted. The only thing that could be detected was an increase in noise levels. This technology was unavailable to Cygon or Cryo 8. Envoy F and Fourth could not hear them. At least that's what Third assured. What do you think about Envoy F and Fourth? Third spoke with slightly more tension than his usual tone. Regarding Fourth, I can say that, though he is still affiliated with Cryo 8, he is currently executing directives directly from Cygon. I've never seen a messenger from the distant orbits who knows Oath so well, and apparently he has been under the crest of Cygon for quite some time, judging by how ideologically polished he is. But I think his awareness level is minimal. He's had plenty of opportunities to make a move, and yet, I even suspect, Second continued, that Fourth isn't briefed on the details regarding Envoy F. Any new considerations on this matter? Clarified Third. No one thing was immediately clear. F is a quiescent interjected first. Quiescent with synchronization levels like an intendit's. Additionally, despite the Cygon crest on his shoulder, it seems that his modifications are orders of magnitude superior to Cygon's. That's good, that we know whom we are dealing with. In any case, we're almost there, and I don't think it's worth changing the plan. As for these guys, we also have something to show, and now it's time to switch localizers and take medication. Third, ended the communication session, leaving only deliberately generated noise on the line. Envoy F also understood that this was their final joint path. When the information exchange and modeling will be completed, he would no longer be needed to them, nor they to him. He immediately noticed the noise that hadn't been there before in the exchange channels. This could have been put down to anything from deliberate interference created by Entra to artifacts caused by the exchange of massive information packets, but his intuition was telling something else. Almost certainly, someone was now using a covert channel to exchange data. F applied several decoders, but nothing in his arsenal yielded any results. He couldn't even discern who exactly was exchanging hidden information. He needed just a couple of seconds to lower synchronization levels to basic, free up resources in the frontal cortex areas, and generate a single transvision impulse. Based on neurotransmitter profiles, he would immediately get the answers he needed. Yet he understood that he might not have enough time to subsequently raise the system to the required synchronization levels, which meant that one of those 4 could take him out and would have every right to do so, regardless of which side he was on. Each envoy was equipped with detectors for determining abilities of certain homostrain. If someone will use transvision or heteroprojection on an envoy, he immediately becomes a primary target for elimination. It was an unspoken rule ensuring survival. Not to use abilities of the strain on members of your own squad, and if such use was detected, to attack immediately and investigate afterward. And so, at least until the first shot was fired, Envoys 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and Envoy F were members of the same squad. Therefore, even if it was F who fired first, he had no margin for error. Neither did the others. The best option would be to gain the support of one of them. If involuntarily thought of 4th, although he also considered 4th as a target that might need to be eliminated first. 24 hours later. Station Barra. 7th Synchroner of Saigon Corporation. Hall of Overseers. Overseer Zind continues his report. According to our assumptions, already confirmed, Ursa's leadership through defectors plan to exceed the limit of indirect targets on the side of Antra Corporation, giving Antra grounds to request from the highest council an increase of the limit of indirect losses on Cryo 8 side. The only one who would benefit from such an outcome would be the first Quinocoration Ursa, which would get the desired prolongation of the conflict. Antra, which was ready to surrender its megapolises but needed a pretext, would be forced to comply with the circumstances, request an increase in the indirect limit, and then launch an indiscriminate attack on the area of operation with high probability of eliminating Cryo 5 envoys. Any other action in such a situation would compromise them. The defectors, as we believe, were promised an evacuation route with the possibility of transitioning under Ursa's crest. Hologram representing Advisor Ryu on the middle left column raised its head, and a giant face appeared on the previously faceless statue, shrouded in thick clouds of artificial atmosphere. However, instability is resolved, but somehow Antra Corporation has fully absorbed the megapolises, and we no longer have direct influence in this area. How could this have happened? Zind continued, under rapidly changing conditions, our envoy, namely Envoy F, prioritized the primary mission objective, to end the conflict in the shortest term. In addition to Envoy F, we also had direct influence over the 4th envoy in this operation. Although he still formally belonged to Cryo 8, we had been supplying him with information, and for this mission, he was additionally equipped with some of our technologies, particularly extended decoders for audio sensors. According to our calculations, this should have allowed bypassing the new encryption method recently adopted by Ursa Corporation, which we suspected the defectors might use. Envoy F, as well as the 4th envoy, were supposed to act independently in the beginning of the operation. The optimal development scenario assumed that they would quickly identify each other as friendly envoys and jointly identify the traitor. Ultimately, that's what happened, but unfortunately it happened at the very last moment. The 4th envoy, as expected, identified defectors that acted in the interests of Ursa Corporation, and unfortunately all 3 Cryo 8 envoys turned out to be them. He managed to signal Envoy F before engaging with the 3 defectors. Envoy F was supposed to recalibrate the vector bio at that time, as the parameters of the latter significantly increased the damage to indirect targets. What then caused the conflict between the 4th and Effa? The hologram on the 2nd column to the right, belonging to Advisor Psi, adjusted the wide hood, as if shielding from the enormously large Venus sun, that now was above the columns, causing a ripples on the holograms. The issue was that by the time Envoy F gained access to the vector bio, the limit for indirect targets had been exceeded, yet only 4 main targets were neutralized. Envoy F, as expected in such a situation, made the only correct decision, which led to the successful completion of the mission, albeit with nuances. Overseer Zind paused, choosing his words carefully. He looked up at the columns, awaiting questions, but all 4 holograms remained silent, staring at him. Custodian Zind continued. Envoy F decided, within the context of the situation, to adhere to our main strategy of shifting forces toward one of the corporations. Since the consequences of the biovector's work were irreversible by then, Envoy F significantly increased the radius of damage and reduced the specificity of the targets. This led to the elimination of targets, but more importantly, it resulted in much higher indirect losses among non-targeted Antra than Ursa and expected, approximately 60% of the area's population. Other 10% were affected but retained viability. The indirect losses of Cryo 8 were not accurately calculated, but this area is densely populated, and the residential sectors of Cryo 8 are essentially located alongside Antra. So the ratio is likely 1-to-1. The alpha leaders of the megacities from the Antra Corporation, which by that time were ready to request evacuation. Clearance predictably recalibrated and instead asked the Council for the maximum allowable admission in this situation. Given the apparent discrepancy in indirect casualties, the Council granted the request. Instead of fleeing or striking back at the Vector biosite, as the Ursa and defectors expected, in terms of the new, much higher permissions, Antra struck the 5 main Cryo 8 control towers with up to 1,000 proton-anti-proton bombs, hitting about 30% of the indirect targets under the new 35% limit, thus destroying the entire Alpha Echelon leadership of Megacity on the Cryo 8 side, and half of the Beta Echelon leadership. Critical losses among the leaders of Cryo 8's Megacity on Bera are primarily linked to the fact that the leadership of Cryo 8 was prepared to accept Antra's surrender, and was in no way prepared for a massive attack on its main control centers. So, what was the cause of the conflict between the 4th Envoy and Envoy F? Hologram Rue addressed. Isn't it obvious Overseer Zind allowed himself familiarity? F's actions resulted in mass casualties and injuries among the population under the crest of Cryo 8. As far as we know from your report, by this time, the 4th Envoy already prioritized the interests of the Saigon Corporation. That's correct, but unfortunately, such a trait is characteristic of many envoys from distant orbits. He couldn't cope with the emotions caused by the mass casualties among the indirect Cryo 8 population, suffered personal psychological damage, and engaged in physical confrontation with Envoy F, resulting in severe injuries of Envoy 4. But still, to leave the area. Because of the conflict between F and the 4th, the 3 defectors also managed to escape. In the context of new events, how their contacts with Ursa will continue? Overseer Zind summarized the previously silent hologram of Advisor Igbo spoke, and all 4 massive projections assumed the Lotus position, each on its own column, to listen to the conclusions and render their verdict. The conflict has ceased, and Ursa Corporation has accepted the outcome. Envoy F returned with a report, on the basis of which this report was also written. Despite significant losses among the indirect targets, including a high percentage of qualified members of both corporations, the operational capability of the megacities will be restored in less than a month. Reputational losses in relations with Cryo 8 Corporation have been smoothed over by the fact that we have repeatedly pointed out potential defectors. We have also slightly improved their positions in the common markets of other megacities. The loyalty of the Antra Corporation has been enhanced, and several overseers are currently working on establishing closer ties with Antra. As for the 4th Envoy, in my opinion, he is due for removal, and Envoy F has already received instructions to complete unfinished work after the recovery period. The 4 holograms in Lotus position remained motionless for several minutes, presumably deliberating on what they had heard. When the conversation, hidden from Overseer Zind, ended, each hologram nodded approvingly in turn. Lord Zind made the same gesture, and then the projections disappeared, leaving only 4 columns stretching towards the Sun of Venus, which rose above the mountain-like pyramids of the production centers and control towers of Bera Station.
Я вижу, ты, вероятно, хочешь уточнить что-то или продолжить. Если речь о конкретном предложении, пожалуйста, скажи, какое предложение ты имеешь в виду. Если ты спрашиваешь про слово «да», оно само по себе неизменяемое. Но я с радостью помогу с любыми уточнениями. Что именно тебе сейчас нужно